Good afternoon. We are looking at the individual, or Psalm 69, excuse me. Um, Interesting Psalm of David. Um, some of David's Psalms we can put within a time range, but this one, there's no clues necessarily of when that might be. Um, so let's just talk real quick about the primary times David writes lament psalms is during his sufferings under the uh, monarchy of King Saul, right? So there is a period of time where David and Saul are both kings. They've both been anointed as the king of Israel, but only David is the one that God actually wants to be king. Or maybe better said, Saul's monarchy has been rebuked or rejected by God for his inability to wait for Samuel and trust in the Lord, right? So then David's time comes, and then there's this overlap where they're both serving as king at the same time. So that during that time, Saul is actively trying to kill David, and he kind of vacillates back and forth between, liking David and wanting to kill him. And these are truly difficult times for David. The other time that we would kind of point to of very clear suffering historically in David's life. Now, perhaps David is a guy who struggles with emotional trauma that comes out of his sufferings that happened before, right? So, could David still be struggling in times that were not historically terribly bad for him? I mean, it's possible. So, does that mean that? In other words, are all of David's lament psalms written during these two times of suffering in David's life? I mean, we're not necessarily sure, um, but it makes sense to me that they probably were, majority of them. The other time that David goes through suffering that is bad enough that it kind of gets into the pages of the Bible is when his son Absalom rises up and basically steals the throne from him. So these are two crucibles in which David writes Psalms of Lament. Now, Psalm of Lament, in my, I've always tried to define this very simply. I believe that they are that the objective of the Psalm of Lament is to, well, number one, wholly admit or what's the word? Not admit, but acknowledge the sadness, the distress, the perhaps even anger, anguish, right? In other words, not to suffer in silence, but to say it out loud, to name the thing, and by naming it, it has less power. It is a quantifiable thing now. We can address it as opposed to it being nebulous and never really being talked about. So the first thing is we're going to name our distress, and then second, we're going to describe our situation, but with the primary goal of even a little bit of questioning and back and forth with God, but the ultimate goal is to move back to a place of ultimately faith and trust in the Lord. That's where we're headed. That's the point of a lament song. That's what the I think the psalm writer is trying to do. Now it's like when you write sermons, you get it. It's hard to maybe, if you're not writing sermons or at least persuasive speeches, it's hard to wrap your mind around this. But a lot of times you're writing not only to the people that you're addressing, but you're writing to yourself. I think the same thing would apply to a Psalm of Lament. So David's trying to process through his own emotions. And then, by the way, this one in particular, 69, Psalm 69, is a individual lament psalm. Um, And just for a short little tangent, these categories, they come from a thing called, his name was Gunkel. We call it Gunkelian analysis. They're not hard and fast rules. I mean, they really don't apply uniformly to every psalm, but we hold on to them, or we use them merely to have a foothold or a handhold to get a sense of the psalm. Ultimately, a lament psalm, I believe, is trying to move the listener from a place of despair, anxiety, maybe even emotional depression, to a place of faith and trust in the Lord. And usually the method uh, of doing that is to lay out the current situation, the current suffering, then meditate on a biblical time, or not necessarily a biblical. Like sometimes they're so clear, like you can sense that the psalmist or David is talking about like crossing of the Red Sea or the crossing of the River Jordan or other times that God delivered his people, right? But sometimes David will refer internally to times that God has delivered him in the past that we don't necessarily, or we aren't necessarily able to connect up historically, right? But I think that we could all point to that. Like there's probably plenty of times in our life where we can think about and point to that God has delivered us, given us um, forgiveness or clarity, maybe the ability to move past something, or in a variety of ways. How when we deal with suffering, like how God moves us past it, we can point back to those moments. In hindsight, we can look back on them and realize, well, when I was suffering before, God was with me and He saw me through that suffering to a better day. And so, why has anything changed now? And the answer is nothing has changed now. God will continue to move me from a place of suffering to a place of joy and hope and faith, because this is what God does, right? For His chosen people. And what is it? What? How does one become, or how is one? That's become would be a bad word. How does one? Uh, how is one a chosen one? Well, we're chosen by God, and we trust and believe in His promises, right? Now, promises of a Savior, Christ, Redeemer, promises of salvation and, well, forgiveness on the cross, salvation, resurrection from the dead. Christ gives us that as well. So Christ, God, is the one who chooses us through baptism and through the gift of the Holy Spirit, and then He makes promises to us, wonderful promises. And it's a very simple. I mean, it's not simple. It's simple to say. It's a simple like concept, hard to do in real life, which is to trust in God's promises always, in the midst of the very difficult things that are happening, to remember, oh, yeah, God actually still does love me, and He intends to forgive me and bring me home, all these kind of things. Well, we can get tunnel visioned on our suffering and lose sight of what we know, which is a very frustrating thing as a Christian. I'm just as a general aside. Um, Frustrating thing, even I fall into this trap where I know better. I know all the things that God has said. I know His promises. I know the truth of the Apostles' Creed. I know the Scriptures, but I can get locked into looking at a situation in one way and then forgetting the truths and the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. So let's talk a little bit about the typical steps. Now, this is not necessarily going to all track out in our psalm, but these are so in other words, the structure that I have here for you, I'm going to list off, are things that are present but not always present, right? So any one of these five. So here we go. First, summons to Yahweh. In other words, the situation leads you to call upon Yahweh, right? Complaint, lament, proper. So literally just describing the situation, the problem. And unfortunately, I looked at our structure of the psalm today. We're not going to get into it until after today's section. pretty much what we're going to deal with today is the complaint, lament proper, and also the petition and treaty. That's the next part here. So number 2 is the complaint, the listing of what's actually happening. Number 3, considerations inducing Yahweh to intervene, whether by challenging Yahweh's honor, right, which is a common thing, like you've made us your chosen people. You need to act and show to the whole world, right? So in other words, it's not about us. It's about what the world is actually saying about you because you're not acting, right? Which was common. So like the Israelites go into bondage into Babylon. The Babylonians make fun of not only the Israelites but their God. Because well, how can their God allow this to happen, right? He's obviously either not real, A, or B, he's not strong. So that's kind of the idea of, you need to act to defend your honor, Yahweh, right? And then we have exciting his anger by citing the enemies, words, right? So literally as if God doesn't know, right? But nevertheless, this is the process. You just talk about what the enemies of God are doing or what they're saying, or by the nature of the complaint itself. Then number 4, petition and treaty. This is the most significant part of the complaint psalm, maybe of general nature or maybe quite specific. So the petition and treaty is what the psalmist is asking God to do, right? Then 5, conviction of being heard, right? So usually between 4 and 5 is where we'll get our recollection of previous stories, right? So God invites us to pray to him. David, is going to do that, offer prayers to God. And then there's always this kind of assurance. He just knows, he believes that if he cries out to God, God will indeed listen, and he is listening, he has listened, right? So he has this faith that God has heard his prayer. Now the question is, will God do exactly what David wants him to do, or will God do something else, right? It's a good question. Don't really know. I would imagine that a lot of people prior to the exile into Babylon or the northern kingdom, when the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria, were crying out to the Lord for reprieve. And God's answer wasn't reprieve, but rather it was, no, you're going to go into bondage. I'm actually going to make you stronger, and then you're going to come back, and you're going to be better off for it in the long run, right? God's always in it for the long run. He's in it he's in the long game. He's not interested in short-term solutions, which is exactly the nature of Christ, right? Like God doesn't want to just kind of piecemeal the solution. No, he's holding back the arrow, the bright shining arrow that is his son, and he's going to fire at the exact right moment, not to kind of sort of solve the problem of sin, death, and devil, but to crush the devil and death. And how he does that is by wiping away sin, right? Like it's not a partial problem, right? It's not a partial solution. He fixes everything to the marrow. I mean, the whole works. This is how God does stuff, by the way. He doesn't do piecemeal, halfway solutions, right? Rather, he fixes it completely. So, a lament psalm starts, usually is because of a emotional, awful situation. That's usually the reason for writing the psalm in the first place, the lament psalm in the first place. And we're probably going to get today the summons to Yahweh. That's about all we'll get. But I'll just start off here. I want to kind of talk about why David's upset. So kind of give away the ending before we even begin. Verse 9, I think, really tells you what's going on. For zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me, right? So David is, in other words, zeal for your house. He's faithful. He believes in God. He trusts in the Lord. He's doing all the things that a good king should do. He's trusting in God as God has called him to do, right? Zeal is always kind of used in connection with faith. And the reproaches of those who reproach you, right? So the reproaches here, the big question we're going to have to ask ourselves is, who are the people that are doing wrong to David? Now, sometimes the people who are doing wrong to David are, in fact, people who um, are not part of Israel, like they're foreign countries, foreign nations, things like that. But sometimes the people who are doing evil um, are the people who are part of David's kingdom. They are his own people, which I think brings with it a almost more difficult thing to deal with. Like it hurts more than if it hadn't been, right? I think that's the case with Psalm 69. I think David's dealing with his own people, which makes this whole thing even worse. Especially if it's being, in other words, zeal for your house, being faithful, and people are reproaching God and reproaching me because I believe in God. But you can kind of see that, right? Because if Israel is in dire straits, if they're going through difficulty, and then the people can't quite understand, well, why is God treating us like this? And then eventually that turns from questions to dismay to anger to insults. And then the insults that are aimed at God because he's let bad things happen to us eventually wind up with David. Okay, let's, which by the way makes me think that Psalm 69 is a psalm written in the time and era of Absalom, not during King Saul's time. Now there were people during King Saul's time that were anti-David, but there's a much stronger sense of not just Absalom, but like royals within Israel or specifically Jerusalem, important people, um, or just kind of the people. They very much like Absalom. They don't like David, and they're actively trying to kill him. So David is up against his own people, a fair percentage of them. Okay. Let's begin. As you know, typically when it comes to Hebrew poetry, I read the Hebrew just in case there is a language thing. Now, Hebrew doesn't necessarily rhyme. Sometimes what Hebrew will do is they'll do this thing where maybe they have two words in a row that sound the same, or two verses where like one verse will end with a word that sounds like the word that starts the next verse, things like this, or there'll be like one letter difference, stuff like so. Kind of their sound. It's a really funny thing when I talk to Linda Nix and Matt Nix about this. They're experts in sign language, and there's a thing in sign language. I think how Linda signed it was something like this, like hearing person. There's something like you do the ear, and then you do something, and it's like what it means is a hearing person joke. Like, and when you think about it, it's right. We make a lot of jokes. They're called puns, right? Based upon how a word sounds, or in English, often how a word can be interpreted one of two ways, right? But it's the same word. So in other words, when you hear that word, your brain thinks one thing, but then the joke is going the other direction, and that's why it's funny. But there's a lot of hearing person jokes. That's kind of how Hebrew does rhyming, not necessarily like the verses are iambic pentameter or they have the same ending, but sometimes they'll do this little gag where two words will sound similar right next to each other or in important places. So I have done the tradition of reading the Psalms in Hebrew and then translating and then talking about it verse to verse. So that's where we're at. We're in Psalm 69, verse 1. Lamanessa al Soosanim la David. Okay, so to the chief musician, set to the lilies, a psalm of David, right? So the lilies is most likely some kind of definition we have here the Shoshan is the word for lily, and we have a straight trumpet. That makes sense. You've seen lilies with like that. So probably we're talking about a straight trumpet is the instrument. Now, if you're in music at all, you'll know that certain instruments are kind of built like a guitar that's plucked. You're not going to play it like a violin that's bowed, right? A trumpet, a straight trumpet, is actually only capable of an overtone series. It can't play all the notes. It can only play like 1, 5, 8, 3. I think after that it's 6, and then there's an overtone. So you can only play these. You can't play. So you can see it like taps would be a good example. You can only play certain notes on it. You can only play in certain ways, right? So you're not going to play like a lot of scales and stuff. You're going to play like certain kinds of music. Instruments lend themselves to certain kinds of music. Now, do we know what that is? No. All I want to point out is that most likely there was a rhythm style and probably a set of notes that went along with a typical lily trumpet. And the poetry was written to be chanted to that kind of accompaniment. And that would have affected its style, its shape, the psalm style and shape, and the psalms also probably number of syllables each verse, things like that. Anyway, and although that stuff is not necessarily as exact, because we really don't know what ancient Hebrew chanting and what these, like, we often get suggestions as to how the song should be played. We have zero idea what that would sound like. We really don't, because none of that stuff has survived. We have, Hebrews chant in a certain way, but the problem is that post exile, and then all the difficulties that happened during the time, like Roman Empire times, and then post Christianity and things like that, a lot of this stuff has been lost, and then it was rediscovered. But as it was rediscovered, some of these things were lost permanently. So we're not 100% sure what that would have sounded like. Nevertheless, that just gives you a sense of the text and what it's trying to tell us. Let's go on. Hovese'eni Elohim ki ba'u ma'im ad napes. No. Is that not? No. I thought that would be nafesh. Like it would be not a P, but a F sound, nefesh. Wow, that's weird. Why would they use nefesh? Yeah. Well, it's strange because we know nefesh. We've talked about that a lot. Oh, well, look at that. Okay. So nefesh is this idea of my soul, my life, my being. Like a Hebrew understanding of nefesh would be the essence that makes up you. And that's not like a new agey spiritual thing. But what I'm saying is Hebrews believe that the essence of you is not just your soul. That's kind of a Greek thinking. It's like, oh, well, all that matters is your soul. No. Hebrews understand that your body, your personality, your physicality, and when I think of physicality, I think of like either a ballet dancer or a guy like Chris Farley, or like literally how they move affects and dictates what they are, right? I think the body that Chris Farley was placed in was part of the reason that made him who he was, right? I did a little ballet dancing in my day back in the day in high school, and I always noticed that ballet dancers had a different ballet dancers. They just had a different way of looking at life, and they had a different way of carrying themselves, how they carried themselves, how they touched things, and it's all very graceful, right? And I think it affects your brain, how you talk, and like all these things kind of reflect. And so Hebrew understanding of nefesh is awesome, because this Greek idea of soul, and this is part of the reason we have such a problem with transgenderism right now too, is like this idea that your soul is completely untethered from your body. Hebrews will say, no, Your soul is completely ensconced in your body. Your body affects your soul and vice versa. You can't separate these two things. So to mutilate your body is to mutilate your soul. Like that's just the Greek idea that you just kind of this spirit inside a flesh puppet, right? You can change this however you want, do whatever you want to it, make it whatever you want. That's not what God wanted, right? He created each and every body. He created every unique thing in your body purposefully, and he meant for you to live in it with joy. You know. So, but you get down to some definitions of nephesh here, and you get to the throat is one of them. Just crazy. So, trying to figure out what word Hosseini is. Let's look it up. Is it Yeshav? It is Yeshav. Okay, yeah, it's to save. What is the parsing here? Hifil. Okay, that makes sense. Hifil imperative. So an imperative would mean that the psalmist is giving God a command, which, by the way, I think is bold, right? But so can anyone boss God around? No. Should we do it? Probably not. But what is it? What is? I think you can command God to do things that He's already said He's going to do. Right? He wants to save you. He's going to save you. So giving Him an imperative to hey, this thing that you said you were going to do it now. I don't know. This is how David prays to God. I don't know how else to understand it. Perhaps the only thing I can say to it is maybe there are times where we should pray a little bit more like David and a little less like Lutherans. Anyway, save me, Elohim, God. It's a basic word for God. And it's not Yahweh, but it's God. Save me, God, for Mayim, waters. Same word that God uses for waters in Genesis, right? The waters were without form and void, and the spirit hovered over the face of the waters. So interesting word. Lots of interesting things that come up with that, right? Same word that God talks. I mean, well, it's pretty obvious. It's going to be the same word. It's a pretty basic word, but same word used as separating the Red Sea. Waters were piled up as a heap on either side. So I think it's fair enough to kind of dive into those stories, or at least have them in the background as context for this psalm. And what I mean by that is the chaos and in Exodus, the suffering and difficulty of these issues with waters, right? So this is, background. Yes, difficult times. The waters have come up to my neck, right? So we can understand the command now, because if the waters are up to his neck, how much time does he have left? Not much, right? Now, this is what a lament psalm often does, is that David kind of grabs you by the face and just, pulls you up close. And it's almost like, it's funny. It's almost like a TV show. Have you ever seen this in a cop show, or even maybe like a sitcom? Well, they'll show you the end of the show first, or like close to the end, the crux conflict coming into focus, and then they'll say 3 days ago, and then they'll backtrack and show you how we got there, right? Well, I think this is kind of what David's doing. He's like, look at me, I'm about ready to die. And then he's going to go back and kind of explain to us how we got here. So the very first thing you receive is from David. If you're not God and you're not David, but you're the listener, the very first thing you understand is, man, something crazy is going on. What do I know about David? Well, David was chosen because he had a heart like that of the Lord, right? A heart that loved the Lord, that was passionate towards the Lord. So David's not a bad guy in this story necessarily, as far as we know, right? So if we know David and David says this, then the only question we have left to ask is, what the heck is going on in Israel to God's people? right? It's the very first thing whoa, what's going on here? Or maybe even like more specific, what's going on to David, right? Verse 2, Tabati, Beven, Mesula, Va'ain, Ma'omad, Bati, Bema'amaka, Ma'im, Vesibolet, Setapateni. Tabati, I sink in mire. Probably, no, it probably would be this. Deep would be describing, I think, mire. So I sink in deep mire where there is no, I think like what, landing place or standing or foothold. Yeah, okay. So in other words, he's sinking down in deep mire. There's nowhere to put his feet to stop him from sinking. Yeah. I have come, Ba'ati. I have come into the deep waters and where the floods overflow me. I've come, that seems strange. Maybe there's a better way to translate that. I've come, I go, I've entered, maybe. What does the ESV say? I've come, oh, no, just I've come. Well, they're probably trying to keep it literal. I've come into deep waters and the flood sweeps over me. Yeah. Overflow me, sweep over me. Yeah. So I can't help but wonder here. It's first come in singular. So it's David talking himself when he says this, I have come, right? Is the situation being thrust up? Because the first verse makes you think the situation is being thrust upon David. But now the second verse makes you wonder, well, has David brought himself into the situation? Has he, are we talking like a Bathsheba kind of thing? Has he done this to himself? So, I mean, we have a lot of questions and a lot of good stuff. We've only got 2 verses in. It's a good psalm. I think when we think about Hebrew poetry, I've talked about this before, but I'll share it again. Okay. I think I think probably it's true of all poetry too, is that you're smashing words together in abnormal ways to develop more meaning and like art, right? New ways of thinking, new perspectives. It's very much like probably I'd imagine like genetic science or science in general. Like this is how you're inventing new things by like trying new processes together or putting 2 things that shouldn't work together. Maybe they will. So this is what you do with words, right? You're trying to express complex emotions and thoughts by smashing words together that shouldn't normally go together. I was kind of schooled by Professor Seleska in this, and by the way, don't. This is my understanding of him. This is not necessarily what he teaches. It could be wrong. So don't. If this is totally awful, then blame me, not him. But my understanding of what he would kind of teach about this is that each stanza, each thing would kind of float up, almost like the little piece inside of a magic 8-ball, right? It just kind of floats up, and we see it, and then it goes away, and then another one comes up, and we see it, and so almost in real time, we're not only interpreting the verses themselves, but how they actually connect to one another. What's the journey that David's taking us on, right? So even right now, we start off with like David's in a terrible situation, water's up his neck, and then suddenly David's referring to like, well, I walked out into these deep waters, and I think that would be a logical thought train for us to be considering as we go forward now, right? But think about how each verse connects to the previous one and also connects to what's going on, and like what is this not only individual feelings, what is this kind of like active, feeling, emotional, or nephesh maybe, right? Roller coaster that David's taking us on. how is he doing that? So verse 3. Yagati Bekarei Nehar Geraoni Kalu Ane Meyahel Elohe. Okay. I am weary. I am weary with my crying. My throat is dry. My eyes fail while I wait for my God. So David in verse 3 doesn't give us really an answer to the question that came up before. Did David do this to himself? At least right now, he's not interested in telling us that story. Rather, he's going to discuss to us just, I think we can identify with this too. And there's got to be something here. There's got to be something here. So David is, one of the greatest characters in the story that is the reconciliation of all things to God. And when I say that, I mean the economics, the economy of salvation. By that, I mean from creation until now, everything, right? David is one of the greatest people in that story of faith and passionate love of God, right? So then when we hear that David is in a situation where he's crying to the point where, he's exhausted from his crying. His throat is so dry he can't get words to come out. And I'm interpolating that, but that happens to me when my throat gets dry. I can't even speak anymore. Yeah, and I've been, I think we all, but I shouldn't say that. Maybe we all haven't, but I think there is someone. I think a lot of people can understand like a place of depression and sadness that's so strong that you're crying to such an extent, and you're carrying on to such an extent that literally you're dehydrated, right? I mean, like that has literally happened to me before. So you're crying to such an extent, and your throat is dry, so he's dry and dusty. His eyes are failing, and I've you probably experienced this maybe too. I have, where you're crying to such an extent that like your eyes get foggy, they get kind of blurry. I think what the reason is because all of those tears, they mess up the balance, the salinity balance in your eyes, right? They don't, the saline in your eyes literally is not working correctly. You can get, and then you're rubbing your eyes, so they're all puffed up in there, and then sometimes I'll get like gunk in the corners of my eyes and along my eyelids too, just from all the crying and things like that. So I think that's what he's talking about, is that there's this, like, literally I'm having trouble seeing, right? Why? Well, I think we can track back to verse 1. The waters are come up to my, so David is like suspended in a terrifying place. I think that's probably a great fear for many people. The idea of kind of being tortured to your very limits for extended periods of time. So he's like at the point of drowning, but it just keeps going and going and going, and it doesn't ever stop. And this is where he's at, right? All of these things, he's crying, and his throat is dry, and his eyes are failing. Why? Because he's been waiting. He's waiting for God to answer, and God won't answer. Now, David has a flair for the dramatic. So has David waited that long? Well, I mean, you think about the scriptures. For to the Lord a day is 1,000 to 1. So what is, in other words, what is long to God? Well, nothing's long to God. God is timeless, right? So we have to probably be careful about applying our sense of time to God, right? David's weary because he's been waiting forever. Well, has it really been forever? Probably not. But we also are people who are corporeal, and we are finite. We live in one moment in time. We can't go backwards. We can't go forwards. We live now. And time passes at time for us because of our because our understandings are colored by emotions and life situations, and we're not digital, right? Our brains aren't digital. Time can pass fast or slow, depending upon what our emotional state is. I mean, that's just true. So I mean, we probably experienced this. I know I have. Time seems to drag on when you're in a place you don't want to be. And meanwhile, when you're enjoying, life, and especially like now that we have kids, and just I love them to death. It seems like time, especially them growing, is going by so fast, right? Meanwhile, I can remember back when I was at Crestwood Elementary in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, sitting and watching that clock get to 3:15, and I swear that minute thing would like go back and forth. Those minutes seem to take forever for the class to be over for the day, right? Well, but now it seems like I sit down and I blink and it's 4 o'clock and it's time to put the kids up and go home. Trying to get work done is somewhat stressful at times, right? So this is David's understanding in the middle of terror, in the middle of suffering, in the middle of suspended on a knife's edge of life and death. His understanding is that he feels like he has waited for God for so long. He has no more tears to shed. He has no more voice to speak. His eyes fail him. Right? This is a dark scenario. It is a sad one. Okay. So now we go on. Verse 4. Rabu Misa wrote Rosi Sonee Hinam Esamu Mas Mete Oyeba Seker Aser Lo Gazalti Az Asib. Wow. Okay. So I think how this is supposed to be translated here is, there are more of those who hate me than hairs on my head. Yeah, so the ESV translates it, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Hinam, without cause. This one is interesting to me, just for a second, to do a tangent for a bit and a joke. At the rate that my wife and daughters lose hair, this verse is either more or less scary. I swear that these girls are dropping hair all the time, and yet they still have full heads of hair in their head. I don't know where this hair is coming from. I don't know if they're growing new follicles like every other day, but I cannot figure out how any woman can lose this much hair and still have hair on her head. It is a mystery. Hairs on the head it has been used in the scriptures. Jesus uses this idea, as does God when he talks to Abraham. It's just used as an idea to talk about many. It's a big idea. There's a lot of hairs in the head. So it's hard to even imagine, right? Counting all the hairs in your head, probably in the, what, 100,000s maybe? And David's saying there's this many. Again, I think David is a little, he can be a bit dramatic. Are there actually this many enemies that hate him? Well, if you're thinking, if David is a parallel for Christ, which he is, anytime David writes a psalm or anytime David is speaking as a psalmist, I mean, you can literally just kind of graft Jesus Christ on here and realize that, no, this could be Christ speaking. You talk about the enemies of Christ, yeah, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people who hate Christ. We're talking about the entire legion of hell, plus people on this earth, past and present, who have hated the Lord. I mean, that gets to be a big number. Are there this many people that hate David? Well, again, if you go into the realms of those who hate God, and he's already kind of said that, right? We go back up to, let's see here. Oh no, when I jumped ahead, we talked about it, right? Verse 9, the reproach. So in other words, in verse 9, he talks about the people who reproach you reproach me. Well, if you talk about people who reproach the God of Yahweh or they reproach Yahweh, that's a lot too. That's a big number. So I mean, if David means that, well, then it probably makes sense. But it's very dramatic. Let's just put it that way. And then we go. So after without cause, right? Then we go into they are mighty. Something like my enemies who would destroy me are mighty. What is the ESV translated? Um, Mighty, yeah, okay, so they start with mighty instead of how I did it. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies. You know, was wrongfully. I think Zakar is where we're getting the lie idea from. Yeah, deception, falsehood. That makes sense. So, mighty are my enemies who would destroy me with lies, with deceptions. So they attack me with lies. Yeah. Though nothing I have stolen, Gazalti, still I must restore it. The ESV translates, what I did not steal, now I must restore. I've had in my life as a pastor, for whatever reason, people will disagree with you on theology. That happens from time to time. And usually in a Lutheran church, it's not even like basic theology. It's just it's practical. It's how you actually apply it. So, you make a case for like the actual theology of communion. Paul talks about it, that we should discern, right? People usually don't have a problem with what Paul actually writes, but when you as a pastor say, well, perhaps we should actually discern, we should actually do this thing that Paul's saying, and then how to apply it, well, then people get upset, right? Um, and then like worship, I believe in Orthodox divine service, Lutheran hymnody, this kind of worship, right? And people get, bent out of shape for a lot of reasons as to why we're not doing something different or something new. Yeah. But most of the time, like it's not even this stuff. It's just personality stuff. Like that people want you to act a certain way, to talk a certain way, to be a certain way as a pastor, and you're just not that thing, and they just start to dislike you. You're not outgoing enough. You're not gregarious enough. These kind of things, or you don't know how. Maybe you're a little awkward. You don't know how to talk. I've met some pastors who are kind of awkward. That I think, but I think it comes with men who are very sensitive, and when I mean sensitive, I don't mean like emotionally. I mean sensitive in terms of they read the scriptures. They really understand them. They're sensitive to what it has to say. So they're thoughtful, wise people, but they're not necessarily like just completely comfortable talking to anybody and they're gregarious and this kind of thing. Well, the scriptures don't say that a guy has to have personality. The scriptures say that he has to have his family under control. He has to be able to do hospitality. He has to be able to teach, and he has to be able to. The biggest thing in Timothy is that a pastor should be is faithful. That's the number one thing. Is he faithful to the Lord? Personality never factors in. It's not an issue. It's not something that Paul is concerned about, right? And by Paul, I think we could, I think, make an extension to even the Lord. So you have people. I mean, I can think of the majority of conflicts I've had with people was as pastor is when I've just like said, look, this is what the scriptures actually teach, and they don't like that answer, or it's a personality thing. We're just not like people who get along personality wise. And then, you know, this is the life of a pastor. I'm sure many pastors have undergone it. When someone decides to have beef with you and leave the congregation, you have zero control over what they say. And I've had some people in the community who do not know what the eighth commandment means. They do not put the best construction on everything, and they are only interested in putting the worst construction on everything. And I'll be honest with you, I've had people who have literally lied, straight bald-faced lie about the things I did or said. This one hits me at home. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure in your professional lives, you who are going to watch this video, right? You've dealt with this, where you've had people just completely misinterpret, probably on purpose, or just bald-faced lie about things you have to say. And it's incredibly frustrating, right? And that's why when he's like, so he talks about this, they destroy me through lies. I can't, I can't agree with that more. They attack me with lies. They lie about, because at the end of the day, you do this work because you want to help, and you're hopeful that someday you'll get to go home, your heavenly home, and hear the Lord say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Like all you're concerned about is that someday the Lord will say, "The work you did was not always perfect, but it was good, and I thank you for it." Right? Like that's all. And then, I turn and say, "Thank you for saving me." Right? I mean, like I did nothing in comparison to what you did, and I think God knows that too. Right? We're not talking about salvation of myself. We're just talking about God placed before me ministry and His works, and I did them, and when He says, "I'm glad you did them," that's going to mean everything in the world, right? So that how you're viewed by community, or maybe more important, how you're viewed by God, right? When that's taken, it is crippling. It hurts so much when someone, because there's really nothing you can do about it, right? You can't. I mean, you could take them to court and maybe sue them for libel or something, but there's really nothing you can do at all about it. You have to just kind of trust it. So then we're back to the very first verse, right? We just trust in the Lord. The Lord's going to sort it out on the last day. But it's hard. It's hard. My most important thing in life, as I've gotten older, is that I care what people think. All I want is for people to look at me and not say like, "Oh, he was an exceptional preacher." I just want people to say like, "He served the Lord." With everything he had, he served the Lord, and he was sincere in his service. That's it. That's all I want. And so when people are, I think David's probably the same way, because he's passionate towards the Lord. I'm not saying I'm David, by the way. Don't overthink that one. So I can see why David is kind of just destroyed by the lies. It would just, like, think about. So you want the ultimate description of this? People at the foot of the cross. He saved others. Save himself. Right? He said he was the Christ. Let him come down from the cross. Like, can you imagine how much that would have just hurt? It's like, I'm literally dying for you. And you're absolutely questioning everything I've ever done for you. I mean, it's a punch to the stomach. All right. We are way over time, and I way overestimated how far we can get through. It's probably mostly because I'm blathering on and on. Okay. Why don't we finish? Let's see here. I want to look at this. Yeah, let's finish with verse 5, because verse 5 is the scriptures are telling us it's like kind of a pause. So let's finish with verse 5. Elohim ata yadata le'evalti ve'asmo'ote mimeka lo nechadu. Elohim, God, okay, and yadata is to know, right? So, God, you know my foolishness, and my sins from you are not hidden. So, I think what David's maybe saying is, I know my sins. You know my sins, right? The persecution that I'm going through right now is not on the basis of this. But again, we go back to verse 9. It's on the basis of what? I have had a zeal for your house, and people have reproached God, and now they're reproaching me because I love you, right? Um, so my sins are not hidden from you. Probably something we should remember. There is it's not a real fun thing to think about, but remember this. Even though our sins are not hidden from God, He still loves us, um, which is hope. Okay, we're gonna stop there. We're gonna pick it up at verse 6 next time. The Lord be with you. Have a wonderful weekend. Make sure to go to church. Make sure to go to Bible study with your pastor, and the Lord bless and keep you. Oh, and those of you who serve our armed forces, and those of you who've lost loved ones, I hope it is a very blessed Memorial Day. We're going to do our typical thing what we do with family and the kids, which we usually try to go out to. I think this year we'll probably go out to Hartford Cemetery and we'll pay our respects to various people. And just, I always try to walk the kids through the cemetery and remind them that everything that they have came at great cost. I think that's probably what we should all do on Memorial Day is just remember that even this day that we have free from activity came at great cost. Um, Lord bless and keep you. Have a wonderful weekend.